Hello, greetings from Basel in Switzerland to you all over the world, wherever you are, who hear and see these sermons. We're in a series of sermons on the book of Acts, and we've come to the last part of chapter 9, and we'll begin chapter 10 this time. We're at chapter 9, verse 32. Paul has come to Jerusalem and met Peter and James, and has been taken away because of threats to Caesarea and sent off to Tarsus. And now we begin at verse 32. As Peter traveled about the country, now the apostles began to go different places to preach and to encourage the different groups of people that were part of the church. And they were probably all Jews at that time. As Peter traveled about the country, he went to visit the Lord's people in Lydda. And there was a group in Lydda because of Philip, who had been to south to baptize the Ethiopian eunuch treasurer. That was a surprise to him. And then he came north and he went along the coast or near the coast to various places and evangelized, and groups of Christians developed wherever he had been. And he went to Lydda, where Peter is going, and he went to Joppa, and he went to Caesarea, and he stayed in Caesarea because that's where he was originally from. So Peter is going to visit and encourage the people that had been converted through Philip and then subsequently to that. There in Lydda he found a man named Aeneas, who was paralyzed and had been bedridden for 8 years. Aeneas, Peter said to him, Christ Jesus heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. Now, it doesn't say so, but I assume that Aeneas asked to be healed, because it's very common in the healing ministry of Jesus and the apostles that healing is not imposed by surprise on someone. It's similarly that I don't think baptism should be imposed on anyone, that people who ask to be baptized should be baptized. So I think Aeneas would have had some conversation with Peter and asked to be baptized, and then Peter said, Jesus Christ heals you, not I heal you, but Jesus Christ heals you. Get up and roll up your mat. Now, the Greek for roll up your mat is a little complicated, and it means get dressed or get your things in order, and it implies get ready to sit at the table and eat something. Immediately, Aeneas got up. All those who lived in Lydda and Sharon, which is the plain north of Lydda, saw him and turned to the Lord. Now, Luke means a great number of people. He doesn't mean every single person in that area. And it seems likely that all of those means the Jews, because at that point, the apostles were only preaching to the Jews, because everybody understood that salvation was for the Jews, and they didn't really think of preaching to the Gentiles. And we don't know what effect Philip baptizing the Ethiopian eunuch had on him, but perhaps it slipped into the background and he continued only to preach to the Jews. In Joppa, a city very nearby, verse 36, there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas, and it means gazelle. She was always doing good and helping the poor, and she helped the poor much by making clothes for those who needed clothes. When I was a child in California, my church and many churches had what was called a Dorcas Society, and it was a group of older women, retired women, who gathered together for fellowship and coffee and cake and to sew. And they sewed things for people that were known to need clothes, especially warm clothes. They sewed things for missionary effort overseas to send with missionaries. And sometimes they made quilts. It was called the Dorcas Society or the Quilting Society. Well, now in our Western culture, so long after the Depression, not many people really need Christians to make clothes for them, but there still are needs, like visiting people, especially people in old people's homes. And it would be good if older people who were functional and perhaps could drive would form groups in churches to serve in this way. About that time, she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Now, it says they washed her body, but they didn't anoint it for burial. And burial in those warm climates was either the same day someone died or the next day after someone died. And it seems that they knew that Peter was in the area, and they had some idea that there might be a resurrection. So they didn't anoint her because it would be greasy perfumes and oils and things like that. Lydda was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, they sent 2 men and urged him, "Please come at once." Peter went with them, and when he arrived, was taken upstairs to the room. All the widows stood around him, crying, and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. Now, they showed them to him. Probably they were wearing them, because they were widows who possibly had no source of income, and Dorcas had been making clothes that they needed for them, and they were very grateful to Dorcas and very sad that she had died. Peter sent them all out of the room, and this may be because he remembered being with Jesus when he raised the daughter of Jairus from the dead. He sent everyone out of the room. Then he got down on his knees and prayed. Turning toward the dead woman, he said, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He took her by the hand and helped her to her feet. Then he called for the believers, especially the widows, and presented her to them alive. This became known all over Joppa, and many people, probably Jews, believed in the Lord. Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a tanner named Simon. Now, Peter was very hesitant to preach to Gentiles because they were unclean and they were certainly not part of the synagogue. But this may be sort of a step, because a tanner was in some ways unclean to the Jews, even though he was a Jew, and he lived outside the city by the sea where there was a water source for his tanning work. But he had to touch dead animals all the time, which would have made him unclean generally. And so Peter went to stay with an unclean man, which seems like a step toward preaching to the Gentiles. Now we begin chapter 10, and chapter 10 is a long, exciting account, and we're only going to do part of it and leave it as a sort of a cliffhanger for next time. At Caesarea, where Philip lived, there was a man named Cornelius, a Roman name, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. And a centurion was a non-noble military officer who was in charge of 100 soldiers. That's why he was called a centurion, and was necessarily a Roman citizen. And Caesarea was called Caesarea by Herod in honor of Caesar, who gave him the city and the place. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. So he would have been aware of the God of the Jews, and he would have acknowledged this God as God, and he would have attended the synagogue and sat in the place for the Gentiles, and he would have given generously to those in need because he was wealthy. But he would not have been circumcised, and he would not have made sacrifices to the synagogue because he was a God-fearer. He was not a proselyte. He did not become Jewish. But he prayed to God generously, and he lived in generosity and in compassion that belonged to the law of Moses. And this is a principle that I have sort of developed in my own thinking, that as we become Christians, we have justification. We are made just by Jesus Christ, declared innocent. And then we have sanctification, the growth in becoming more full in our lives, more sanctified, more like Jesus, to become more mature Christians. And then we have glorification when we have our new bodies and are with the Lord forever. It seems to me that in the case of Cornelius, and actually many people, they want to know the truth and they're interested in being real, and they find out something about the biblical Judeo-Christian principles, and they try to live like that, and they grow in something like the fruits of the Spirit. And I think it is sanctification before justification. So when someone is justified, they get saved, we think of them as a young Christian just beginning. But if a person has had quite a bit of sanctification before they believe in Jesus, immediately after they get saved, it seems like they're an old Christian because they have the habits and the practices of a Christian that they're quite used to. And so they come in at a fairly advanced and stable level, whereas someone who has been living as a drug dealer or something like that suddenly gets saved, and then they're really a young Christian at the beginning. So it varies with each of us how this works. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God, a messenger, who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Now, this that he saw was by a window between the natural and the supernatural dimensions of reality that God opens. And he very often in the Bible opens the window when someone is praying, because to pray is to connect with the eternal and the supernatural. And that connection God can use to open up a window more fully, and he does sometimes, so that we experience other dimensions of reality and have quite a profound experience. And very often when people have this experience, God speaks to them directly or through an angel. I think it's important for 2 reasons to realize that it's not the people who open the window. One is that's magic, and we're not supposed to control the supernatural. And the other one is religion is people trying to reconnect with God by opening up and getting through windows or doors to find truth, to find God. Christianity is in a way the opposite of religion. It's God opening the window and coming to us. Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God," sanctification. "Now send men to Joppa to bring back a man named Simon, who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. So we see he lived in a large house with a household of family and servants. He was quite wealthy and established in Caesarea. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. About noon the following day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, well, it's a 10-hour strong walk between Caesarea and Joppa, so they hadn't been wasting any time. They had to rest in the night, but they were really pushing along. It was about noon, and they were already approaching the city. Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat. And while the meal was being prepared, he fell into a trance, which I think is very similar to having a vision. The Greek word is ekstasis, to be outside the state, the general situation. He saw heaven opened, God opening up the window, and something like a large sheet being let down to earth by its four corners. It contained all kinds of four-footed animals, as well as reptiles and birds. Then a voice told him, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." It happens in the lives of conservative Christians, of which I am one, that God leads us to do something that we would really hesitate to do. I can remember in Poland that conservative Christians were very hesitant, thought it was wrong to go to an art museum or a concert. It was a worldly activity. But some of them began to be called, because they met people who were artists or musicians, to go into such a situation to develop a relationship. Or maybe you would never go into a bar where people are drinking, but you know someone who really needs Jesus, and they ask you to meet them in the bar. You might do something that you would not ordinarily do and think would be wrong to do, because God calls you to do it. Now, Peter reacts very strongly. "Surely not, Lord. I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." Now, there are various episodes like this, Moses and particularly Ezekiel, and I'd just like to read you the example from Ezekiel. God had called Ezekiel to do very dramatic theatrical prophecies to the Jewish people living in Babylon, to show them what the situation would be like in Jerusalem when there was a siege and a famine in the city. Ezekiel chapter 4, verse 9. "Take wheat and barley, beans and lentil, millet and spelt, put them in a jar and use them to make bread for yourself." It's a very strange bread to have all those grains together, "but not unclean. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day, and eat it at set times. Also measure out 1/6 of a hin of water and drink it at set times." This is very little to eat and drink. "Eat the food as you would a barley cake. Bake it in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel. The Lord said, 'In this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them.' Then I said," Ezekiel, "Not so, sovereign Lord. I have never defiled myself from my youth until now. I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. No unclean meat has ever entered my mouth." That's pretty cheeky to say this to God. And the response of God is quite remarkable. "Very well," he said, "I will let you bake your bread over cow manure instead of human excrement." So God bargained with Ezekiel and made his demand less offensive to Ezekiel. And we are allowed to speak back to God, and it works out differently in each case. You don't know exactly how it will happen. But Israel is he who wrestles with God, and we are invited to wrestle with God for truth and life and how life should be. "Surely not, Lord," Peter replied. "I have never eaten anything impure or unclean." The voice spoke to him a second time. "Do not call anything impure or unclean that God has made clean." And we think of Mark chapter 7, when Jesus was talking about the dietary regulations of Israel and saying that it isn't what goes into a man, but what comes out of a man that makes him unclean. And then Mark says in a parenthesis, by saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean, which is a huge change in the regulations of the life of God's people. This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheet was taken back to heaven. Now, it seems to me that it was a vision and that Peter did not kill and eat, but he was given this vision by God to teach him something that he would fully learn when the men arrived from Cornelius to ask him to come and to go into the home of a Gentile in Caesarea. So we'll leave it there, and then next time we'll pick it up when Peter goes to Caesarea. So I hope that what we've talked about so far is a blessing and encouragement to you. God bless you. Amen.